Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We often talk about communication patterns and relationships, and today we're really going to zero in on something that can be, well, kind of destructive, verbal aggression. Why does it happen? Especially like how do things from our past, even way back when we're kids, how do those things kind of set the stage for how we communicate with romantic partners later on?
It's a great question, and it's something that researchers have been looking into for, well, for decades, actually.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're focusing on this one study that really got into it. A 20-year study, by the way. Like, wow, that's commitment.
Yeah, the researchers followed over 150 people, starting when they were young teens, like 13, 14 years old.
So high school.
Exactly, and they kept tabs on them all the way into adulthood, like their early 30s. And, they were interested in seeing if there were any connections between what was happening in these kids' lives and then how they interacted with their romantic partners later on.
So what kind of stuff were they looking at? I mean, specifically.
Well, two main things, really. First, they looked at how much verbal aggression these teenagers were exposed to at home. Were their parents yelling at each other a lot, using, really harsh language, put downs, that kind of thing. And then the second thing they looked at was how much conflict these teenagers had with their close friends.
Okay, so basically, like, how much were they surrounded by, I guess, unhealthy communication, whether it was at home with the parents or with, like, their buddies at school?
Exactly. And then years later, they checked in with these same individuals, now adults, and they assessed how much verbal aggression they were using in their own romantic relationships.
Interesting. So what'd they find? Anything surprising?
Well, there were a few really interesting findings. First off, they discovered that both witnessing a father being verbally aggressive towards the mother and having a lot of conflict in adolescent friendships, both of these things, independently predicted higher levels of verbal aggression in adult romantic relationships.
Okay, so it's not just about what's happening at home, it's also about how kids are handling their own conflicts, like with friends.
Right. Both those environments, family and peers, they both play a role. But, and this is where it gets even more interesting, the father's verbal aggression towards the mother only predicted the adult romantic verbal aggression when it was coupled with high levels of conflict in those teenage friendships.
So, like, seeing dad yelling at mom, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up yelling at your partner. But if you combine that with, like, constantly fighting with your friends, then that might be a kind of a red flag.
Exactly. It's almost like if you're not learning how to navigate conflict constructively in your friendships, and then you're also seeing this negative model at home, well, you might not develop the skills to communicate effectively in a romantic relationship later on.
Makes sense. So basically, it's like a double whammy. You're not learning good communication skills, and you're also seeing this bad example being set.
Right. And then another really interesting finding I thought was about like who the target of the verbal aggression was.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think of that.
So if the mom was verbally aggressive towards the dad, that didn't actually predict verbal aggression in the adult romantic relationships. But if the mom was verbally aggressive towards the teenager themselves, well, that did predict later aggression in romantic relationships.
So it seems like directly experiencing verbal aggression, even if it's coming from your mom, is a really powerful predictor of how you might communicate later on.
Exactly. And that's regardless of the parent's gender. It's not just about witnessing it, it's about being on the receiving end. And there were a couple of other, I guess, maybe unexpected correlations they found.
Oh, like what?
For example, they found a correlation between higher levels of verbal aggression in adult relationships and families that had, well, higher incomes.
Really? I would have thought it'd be the opposite.
Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive. And they also saw a similar correlation with racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. Now remember, correlation doesn't mean causation. We can't say for sure why these associations exist.
Yeah, I mean, like you said earlier, just because, ice cream sales go up in the summer and so does crime doesn't mean ice cream causes crime, right?
Exactly. It just means there might be some underlying factors that we need to explore further. But overall, this study gives us a lot to think about.
It does. I mean, a 20-year study, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some limitations. I mean, they were relying on people's memories, which, we all know memories can be a little fuzzy sometimes.
Right. And the study was also limited to a specific group of people, so we have to be careful about assuming these findings apply to everyone.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so let's sum this all up. What are the big takeaways here?
Well, witnessing a parent, especially the father, being verbally aggressive, that can have a lasting impact. And then if you add in a lot of conflict with friends during those teenage years, Well, that can really amplify the effects of seeing that unhealthy communication at home. And then, of course, being the target of verbal aggression yourself, well, that seems to be a key predictor of using verbal aggression in your own romantic relationships later on.
So this has been a lot to process, but, it's important to remember that just because we might have had some, let's say, less than ideal experiences growing up, it doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat those patterns.
Exactly. This knowledge is empowering. By understanding these early influences, we can start to make changes, break those cycles.
Yeah, totally. So for everyone listening, I guess a final thought to leave you with is think about the way you communicate in your relationships. Are there any patterns, any habits, any, ways of talking that might be echoes of your past experiences, either with your family or even with your friends way back when?
And if you notice those echoes, what small changes could you make? Maybe just tiny shifts in how you communicate that could lead to a more positive, more healthy, and ultimately happier relationship going forward.
Great food for thought. Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.